Okay, welcome back to the Maryland 250 Labor History Project.
I think you've frozen on
I'm,
me.
I'm
Oh,
Bill
okay.
Berry, and our guest today is Jane Berger. And Jane is the author of a
Okay.
terrific book about public sector bargaining in Baltimore and the kinds of activities that grew out of the 1960s. So, Jane, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, great. So, how did you get started on this book? You're a native of Baltimore. Where'd you grow
Right,
up?
yeah, I grew up in Charles Village and I went to Mount Royal Elementary Middle School in Bolton Hill because my mother taught near there. And I went to Western High School.
Hmm,
And so I did, as you're saying, grow up during the very period that I focus on well, I missed a lot. I was a kid little for the 60s, but the 70s and the 80s were really my decades. And so as an older person, I was interested in understanding some of the causes of Baltimore's challenge, some of the challenges that Baltimore faces. And I wanted to be able to connect that to national and maybe even international shifts that were underway at the time.
great. And Baltimore, as we know, is the northernmost southern city. So race has
Right.
always been a crucial issue. So what you did in your book was start talking about the civil rights movement of the 60s, but how it became a union movement. So why don't you just describe that for Baltimore?
Sure. I do think the civil rights movement and the larger labor movement in Baltimore were uh, had their own separate identities, but they were also very interconnected. And the place at the overlap where I look is, as you've mentioned, is public sector employment. Because really, during World War II, as some of your listeners and viewers might know, the civil rights activists, William were able to get a temporary ban on discrimination in the war industries. After the war ended and Baltimore residents were very involved in this, there were efforts to make that a permanent, to make the Fair Employment Practices program and the agency a permanent thing that failed time after time in the federal government. And so leadership of the NAACP and other civil rights groups turned their attention to public sector employment and thought, well, if we can at least try to get rid of discrimination as much as possible in the government workforce, that'll trickle out into the larger society because they're government agencies everywhere in the United States. And so that is kind of what happened during after World War II through the 1960s. There was just a concerted effort to win jobs for Black workers in government workforces. In Baltimore, it was successful, particularly during the 1960s, when, well, first of all, during the 1950s, Black voting power in Baltimore became more important because of white flight. White residents were fleeing the cities in search of greener pastures and following jobs that were also leaving the cities. And so the percentage of African Americans in the city grew, not only because of in-migration, but also because their concentration was larger as whites were leaving. And so they became an important electorate to have to court for white politicians who earlier had been pretty ready to ignore Black voters or gerrymander them out of any kind of representation. And so Black voters in the city really started using that power in the 50s. And one of the ways that they could do that, again, was through public sector employment, because you can pressure the mayor of a city and say, wait a minute, how many Black people work in this department and that department, in a way that you can't pressure the head of Bethlehem Steel or General Motors. And so that ability to apply pressure began to pay off. And then the introduction of the War on Poverty, which was a bunch of federal programs, helped the effort tremendously because it sent large amounts of federal funding into cities with high concentrations of poverty. And African Americans in the civil rights movement and beyond saw those changes and were like, well, we've got to get some control over these resources. There had already been contests other way locally. And ultimately, the most important early director of Baltimore's Community Action Agency, which is one of the main anti-poverty organizations, was Perrin Mitchell, whose brother was Clarence Mitchell, who was a prominent in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and his Clarence Mitchell's wife was Juanita Jackson Mitchell, who was very prominent along with her mother uh, in the Baltimore civil rights movement. So the connections there, as you can see, were uh, overlapped a lot, as you're suggesting.
And so how did this become a union movement?
Well, as workers were using their jobs in the city to try to expand. I mean, one of the things that had long been on civil rights activists' agendas was the horrible and separate and unequal services that Black communities and white communities experienced, because Baltimore was a Jim Crow city up until federal civil rights legislation and remained very segregated thereafter, but just not legally. And so improving the quality of services for Black city residents had always been important to civil rights leaders in the city. And this idea of like, wow, now this federal money is coming in. We can use that money to get jobs for Black city residents, and they can use those jobs to improve services. And ultimately, we can use those agencies to have some say over the municipal agenda. And so it became sort of like a win-win-win. But one thing that government workers realized in the 60s, not only in Baltimore, but around the nation, was that having a government job did not guarantee a living wage. And so, as I'm sure people are familiar with, the sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, launched a strike in 1968 after several of their co-workers were killed because of a faulty truck. And they had already organized. They were part of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME, and AFSCME International, because they had Canada as well, leaders went to Memphis, ended up backing that strike. And that strike became, and people are familiar with the sign of men holding a sign saying, I am a man. That is from that strike. And everyone thinks of it as a civil rights photo. It's actually a civil rights slash labor rights
Yeah.
photo because it's from that strike. And sanitation workers in Baltimore, among others, sanitation workers in many cities, and then other public sector workers saw that strike in Memphis, which sadly was the time when Martin Luther King was assassinated. He became an advocate of the Memphis sanitation workers, and during one of his visits to Memphis, he was assassinated. The strikers had not yet won their strike at that time, but they continued to fight, and ultimately they did reach some agreements with the city of Bethlehem, I mean, the city of Memphis, and I live in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So, Baltimore sanitation workers, among others, were like, wow, there was a history of labor radicalism among sanitation workers in other cities. And so, in shortly after the Memphis strike, led by sanitation workers in Baltimore, um, you got a big strike in 1968 that was premised on, you had people in Baltimore carrying the same signs, the I am a man signs that workers had carried in Memphis. And so that kind of launched it. I mean, there were already employee associations and there had been efforts to organize. I mean, there was an AFSCME organization that was active in the city at the time. Really, the Memphis strike and then the Baltimore strikes, there was the people were ready and wanting to make this work to get collective bargaining rights from the city of Baltimore. And so the timing just ended up the
Mhm.
Dr. King's involvement, of course, attracted a lot of attention. His wife, Coretta Scott King, was in Baltimore shortly thereafter with women who were organizing at Johns Hopkins and in other, senior living and healthcare sites.
Mhm.
And so there was an effort to get collective bargaining rights for city workers. Again, this was an area where Black voters could use pressure. It became an election issue on the mayoral level. And so, and meanwhile, and I have to say thank you for the great podcast about the Baltimore Teachers Union, but they had already been organizing and they had Black leadership at the time. AFSCME locally had Black leadership in 68. And so together, they were able to win collective bargaining rights.
Yeah. But I think it's real important for all people watching here to understand that really after World War II, this, what became a civil rights movement also became a workers' rights movement. And
Hmm.
there was a huge activity. You can see one of the clips here from Lee Douglas from Sparrows Point, because Sparrows Point was employment in the mill and in the town were segregated, and they came back, returning servicemen, and said no more. And it was just such a movement. And we're seeing a little bit of that today with the immigrant movement. It's not just in the communities, but it's in the workplace as well.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, and unions, if they want to be successful, need to be attentive to histories and experiences of
yeah,
race. And
it's a
yeah.
very important. What was the most fun part of doing your book?
Well, I'd say talking to people, this is what I'm really enjoying about your series, where you've got people who not only, like I'm a professor, but that's kind of boring. To hear the people who were actually there
Yeah.
is exciting. And one of the people I talked to was Ernie Crowfoot, who was leader and asked me at the state level
Hmm.
at the time that these things were going on. I talked to Raymond Clark as well, but and that was exciting as well. But I think you get some really great insights when you're talking to people that aren't going to be in a Afro-American article or a Baltimore Sun article or in some archive. And so I was able to learn about things like one of the things that AFSCME tried to do during the war on poverty was create job ladders over what had been called, what you could call dead end jobs. So
No,
the
that's right.
state municipal workforce was very racially segregated. And in most cases, like there were the bottom of the tier was kind of reserved for black workers, and you would max out there. And then if there was a position just the next level up, then they'd hire a white person to
Yeah.
and so AFSCME was one of the organizations that fought to say, no way, we want people to be able to have career ladders. And so, in the war on poverty, provided some funding for that through manpower training and so forth. And AFSCME still does that to this day.
Yeah.
And so, Ernie Crowfoot talked about the emotion of people who had worked in the school system as maintenance workers, but who were able to progress to
Yeah.
the next level, and then the next, and just the raw emotion of those moments when people had they had graduation ceremonies,
As I
or
said,
oh, go ahead,
go,
the
go ahead.
joy
I'm
of
sorry.
parents who, when asked me, got vision insurance for city workers. All these kids went to Baltimore City Public Schools, after their parents had their appointment, and they didn't have to sit in the front row. They had glasses and
Yeah.
they were, better. So these little things that you might not think of when you think of American history, are really important events and contributions that led to this, the improvement for working people instead of just this
Yeah.
constant pressure on them to do with the least
Yeah.
possible.
I think the most important thing is working people made this happen for themselves. And one
Absolutely.
of the things I've talked about in my new book is this self-help mentality from the 1930s is gone today in many cases. People depend on the government to kind of do stuff. But the movement that you're talking about in the city parallel the movement at Sparrows Point because black workers were put in dead-end jobs by a contract that had departmental seniority. And they finally broke that in 1974. But there were all kinds of outside civil rights groups, both working in the plant and leafleting and doing radical activities around the town. So it was an enormous upsurge in Baltimore City for the union movement.
Yeah, unfortunately, part of the backlash to the civil rights movement came in some cases, and not at all exclusively, but from white
Yep,
unionized workers who, in a time of feeling that there was scarcity and the jobs were leaving,
yep,
were angered that they didn't get to monopolize all the
yep.
skilled and semi-skilled jobs. But
And you find politicians like George Mahoney running on an
mm,
openly racist segregationist policy in
right.
the 1960s. And you talk about
Mhm.
that in the book, so it's very, very clear. All right. The other thing I want to do before we go is to just tell people there is also a clip on here about an AFSCME strike in Garrett County, which is
Okay.
another place where the union movement came where it had not been before in a very conservative white area, but it was the first public sector strike in Maryland. Len Schindel wrote a book on it. We have a podcast on that on the site.
Yeah, and
Oh,
I think it's important for people to realize in Garrett County and elsewhere that like that was made possible in part because of the union dues that Baltimore's municipal
absolutely.
workers were. So sometimes in within our state, people might feel that it's us versus them, but if you don't have to dig too deeply to see that there are actually
Right.
real connections and
Yeah,
similarities.
no, because it's a movement. And we're
Mhm.
trying to rebuild that movement, and our labor history project is part of that.
Yeah.
All right, Jane, thank you so much. We
Well, thank you.
appreciate your time and the book. All right.
All right. Thanks so much. Bye.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry.